Hello and welcome to Rita's Roost. Well, I'm just a little under the weather, so I'm not doing a lot with this rotator cuff injury or whatever you want to call it. So we're going to read a book. I think this would be a good time for me to just sit and read and maybe read to you guys. Now, this book is The Persian Pickle Club by Sandra Dallas, and it come highly recommended by our friend Jackie. I think she recommended it last summer, and I never did get a chance to read it. I got it, but then I didn't have time to read with all the other things I was doing. So I'm gonna read to you by Sandra Dallas, The Persian Pickle Club. Let's read it. See what it says here. The author, she wrote several other bestsellers. This is for Mary Dallas Cole with love. Sisters like friends are forever, and the acknowledgments. In 1933, shortly after my parents were married, my father lost his job, and he and Mom moved to my grandparents' farm in Harveyville, Kansas. A neighbor offered Dad $1 for a day's labor. Dad worked so hard, he finished by noon and was paid just 4 bits, the only money my parents saw all season. In our family, that was known as the 50-cent summer. The rest of the Persian Pickle Club is fiction. Like scraps of a quilt, the elements of this book came from friends. Thanks to Mom and Dad for the stories that are its pieces, to my extraordinary agent June Jordan Brown and her assistant Danielle Egan Miller, who supplied the design, to Marjorie Baxter and the Harveyville United Methodist Quilting Ladies for assembling the parts, to Bob, Dana, and Kendall for warmth and substance, and to my editor, Jenny Notes, who stitched it all together. Now, we're going to start The Persian Pickle Club. I've not read this, and I may stumble over words and not pronounce them right, but I still like to read, even if my is a little choppy and I kind of mess it up sometimes. Chapter 1. The first time she saw the members of the Persian Pickle Club, Rita told me after I got to know her. Now, I didn't know we were going to have a Rita in this book. I didn't know that. All right, chapter 1, starting over again. The first time she saw the members of the Persian Pickle Club, Rita told me after I got to know her, she thought we looked just like a bunch of setting hens. She learned all about setting hens that very morning after she'd gone out to the hen house to gather eggs. Rita's luck must have been under a bucket, because Agnes T. Ritter saw her checking the roosters, and in that nasty way Agnes T. Ritter has, she told Rita just why she wasn't going to find eggs under a rooster. Then she told Rita to leave the broody hens alone unless she wanted scrambled chicks for breakfast. How would anybody expect Rita to know about hens and roosters when she'd never lived in the country before? Like most town folks, Rita never cared where eggs came from, and after she found out, why then she didn't care if she ever ate one again. Rita was a big city girl from Denver who had more important things to study in college than chickens, like learning how to become a famous writer. I'd never known a woman who wanted to be anything more than a farm wife. Rita was right about us looking like a coop full of biddies. We sat there at Ada Jane's dining room table, clucking as Rita walked in. Then her eyes bugged out, making us look dumb enough to knit with wet spaghetti. I stopped sewing with my hand in the air and held it there so long that Mrs. Judd told me, "Put down your needle, Queenie Bean, and don't stare." Well, I can tell you I wasn't the only one staring. Even Mrs. Judd was peering with watery eyes through her little gold-rimmed glasses. How could she help it? How could any of us help it? We'd all heard Tom's wife was a looker, and after he met Rita at the Ritter place, Grover came right home and told me she was the nicest thing he had seen since Rain. Not that he remembered much about Rain, or that Grover was a good judge of what was pretty, for that matter. He thinks Lottie, the 2-year-old pie-eyed heifer we just got, is a looker too. Grover was right about Tom's wife. However, Rita was as pretty as pie. She had curls like fresh churned butter, not at all like my straight brown bob, and eyes as big and round as biscuits. Rita was little. I am too, but next to me, Rita was the regular teeny weeny. Not much over 5 feet or 100 pounds. Her hands were as plump as a baby's, smooth and soft, and the nails were polished. She smelled good too, not just a little vanilla behind the ears the way I do it, but real perfume, the nice kind that they sell in the drugstores in Topeka. We were chickens all right, and Rita was a hummingbird. It gave us all pleasure just to look at her. All of us except for Agnes T. Ritter. She stood behind Rita looking sour as always, like the wind was blowing past the manure pile right in her direction. President Roosevelt could get out of his wheelchair and ask her to dance, and she'd act like she was two-stepping with the hired man. Agnes T. Ritter had turned up her little sliver of a lip at Rita's dress, which was as dainty as a hanky made of strips of lace and red silk. I could see the strap of a red slip that she wore under it, and I meant to ask Ada Jane where anybody bought a red slip. Grover'd think I'd gone to town for sure if I put on red underwear. We always dress up for Persian Pickle Club, but none of us wore anything as fancy as that. Certainly not Agnes T. Ritter, who wore $1.99 house dresses from the Spiegel catalog and made her own slips. It didn't matter how she dressed, of course, because she was as knobby as a washboard. Agnes T. Ritter, you sure are jealous, I thought. That's when I decided I would be a good friend to Rita. She could use one, with Agnes T. Ritter for a sister-in-law. And with Ruby gone to California, never coming back, I myself needed a best friend my own age. This is Rita, Tom's wife, said Mrs. Ritter, who was Agnes T. Ritter's mother and Rita's new mother-in-law. Naturally, we knew Rita was Rita, but I guess Mrs. Ritter felt it might be a good idea to say something, since not one of us had given her a word of welcome. Our manners must have been under that same bucket with Rita's luck. I was the first one to speak, as I usually am. I smoothed the rick-rack around the neck of my dress and said, I'm Queenie Rebecca Bean, Grover's wife. We're glad Tom came back and brought you with him, because Tom is Grover's best friend, even though Grover went to farming instead of to the university. We live out in the country, 3 farms down from you, in the yellow house that looks like dried egg yolk. The place is even brighter in the fall when the willows turn. Grover says it's like living inside a lemon. I stopped long enough to take a breath and added before anyone else could speak, Welcome to Pickle. I'm the youngest member. Grover always says I'm the talkingest woman he knows when I get nervous. Grover doesn't say a word when he's rattled, so together we're about normal. Rita ran the tip of her tongue over her upper lip and looked at me out of the corner of her eye. I like a stand of willows, muttered old Paulina Ducks, who said something queer most times she opened her mouth, so no one paid attention to her. Ada June Zinn, who was the hostess that day, said, I guess Queenie spoke for all of us. Welcome to the Persian Pickle Club. Rita put out her hand, and Ada Jane stared at it until Mrs. Judd said, Shake it, Ada Jane. That's what it's there for. In Harveyville, women didn't shake hands with one another. Ada June wasn't quite sure what to do, so she put the tips of her fingers into Rita's palm. Rita went around the circle, offering her hand to everybody, and when she came to me, I shook it hard, and she winked at me. When Rita was finished with the handshake, she and Mrs. Ritter sat down in the 2 empty chairs at the end of the table. It was a minute before Ada Jane realized she hadn't counted Rita when she set out the chairs. She was one short, and there was no place for Agnes T. Ritter to sit. Ada Jane jumped up and got an old straight back from the kitchen, and we all moved around to make room. Left standing is the story of Agnes T. Ritter's life. Did you bring sewing, Mrs. Judd? Asked Rita. Mrs. Judd knew she hadn't. Of course, Rita couldn't have gotten a pen from that tiny purse of hers. Oh, Rita said, I don't sew. I never met a woman who didn't sew. None of us had, and we stared at her again until Sarah's root said with a nice smile, "You modern women have so many interesting things to do in this day and age. There's no good reason to make 13 quilt tops before you marry, like I had to when I was a girl." We all nodded, except for Mrs. Judd, who wasn't one to make excuses for other people. Agnes T. Ritter didn't nod either. 100 quilt tops wouldn't help her find a husband. "Sewing's a snap," I told Rita. "You'll pick it up fast." Agnes T. Ritter snorted. She opened her work basket and pulled out a sock and put it over a darning egg. "You could try mending. I hope to say I'm not going to darn your husband's socks for the rest of my life." Agnes T. Ritter was the only one who took mending or plain sewing to the Persian Pickle Club on what we call Quilter's Choice Day. That meant the hostess didn't have a quilt ready for us to work on, so we brought our own piecing or fancy work. We all liked Quilter's Choice because we saw the designs the other club members were working on and swapped scraps of material. There wasn't a quilt top turned out by a member of the Persian Pickle Club that didn't have fabrics from all of us in it. That made us all part of one another's quilts, just like we were part of one another's lives. Agnes T. Ritter was as good a quilter as any of us, except for Ella, of course. Nobody quilted as well as she did. But Agnes T. Ritter wasn't any good at piecing. Her quilts were just comforts made of big wool squares cut from old trousers and blankets and tacked instead of quilted. You put one of those on the bed and you thought you were sleeping under a flat iron. She said she'd just as soon stitch the pieces together with her sewing machine as sew it by hand. Agnes T. Ritter was not born to quilt like the rest of us. We'd rather quilt than eat, even in times like these, when some didn't have much choice. I hope Rita would learn to like quilting as much as I did. "If Rita doesn't sew, she can read to us," said Mrs. Judd. "Oh, Septima," Nettie Burgett said as she bit off the thread on a tea towel she was embroidering. "Can't we skip the reading just this one time? We want to get to know Rita." Mrs. Judd didn't answer, just squinted at Nettie through her thick lenses until Nettie blushed and looked down at her sewing. Mrs. Judd liked to remind us that the Persian Pickle Club had been formed to improve the mind, not just to make bed covers. "I don't care if I do," Rita said. "I guess she was tired of people staring at her and asking her questions. Maybe she was afraid we were all like Agnes T. Ritter and would start picking at her." "Choose something from 101 Famous Poems," I said. It was the only book in Ada June's house except for the Bible and the dictionary and a set of A through C and P through E of the encyclopedia. We'd heard every poem in that book, but it was better than scripture. I did wish, however, that one day Mrs. Judd would open the P through R volume and suggest that we read about the pygmies who didn't wear clothes. I'd seen the picture. So had Ella, who had been looking over my shoulder. She giggled and put her hand over her mouth like we were naughty girls. She had a child's sweet disposition, and things tickled Ella so these days. Ada June handed the poetry book to Rita, who leafed through it, then stopped and read something to herself. "Out loud," Mrs. Judd said, and Rita turned red, while Agnes T. Ritter snickered. "It's Carl Sandburg," Rita said. "Oh, that's not poetry. Give us something that rhymes," Mrs. Judd told her. "How about trees?" I asked. "You know that by heart, Queenie," Mrs. Judd told me. "Read Mr. Longfellow's Paul Revere." The rest of us sighed. Paul Revere's Ride was Mrs. Judd's favorite, and it lasted an hour. It made a nice rhythm for quilting, but I was tired of it. Rita read until she was hoarse, while the rest of us stitched and drowsed and made little sewing noises. Nettie's big shears sounded like tin snips when she cut a thread. Opalina's damp needle squeaked every now and then as she pushed it through her fabric. Her hands sweat a lot. Forrest Ann's quilt pieces rustled and cracked crackled. She was making her grandmother's flower garden and had backed each little five-sided piece with same-size pattern cut from a letter. Mrs. Judd kept time to her rhythm of the poem with her needle, flashing it back and forth before taking tiny stitches in her quilt square. I never knew how a woman with hands as big as a chicken hawk's could make such neat stitches. It seemed that there was never a poem as long as Paul Revere's Ride, and when Rita finally read the last line, Ada June snatched the book out of her hands and said, "The tea kettle's on. Rita, would you help me put out the refreshments?" "I'll help too," I said, and put my sewing down before Mrs. Judd could fuss at me. You didn't need 3 people to serve refreshments, but I wanted to tell Rita not to let Mrs. Judd bother her because she had a nice side when you got to know her. She was loyal, too. There never was a woman as loyal as Septima Judd, but that was true of all the Pickles. Ada June had the same thought, because when I reached the kitchen I heard her whisper to Rita, "Don't mind Mrs. Judd. Her bark's worse than her bite. She's as good a woman as you'll find in the state of Kansas." "If you can put up with living in the same house with Agnes T. Ritter, Mrs. Judd's no trouble at all," I added, picking a thread off my dress. Ada June laughed behind her hand at that, then put on her apron and went to the icebox for the bread pudding, which was her specialty. She wasn't much of a housekeeper. Her quilt stitches were big enough to catch a toenail, and with 6 kids she had grown as lumpy as a Kansas sandhill. But Ada June Zen sure could make bread pudding. Buck Zen said he was a goner the minute he tasted it. Buck rode into Harveyville on a sorrel named Roxy one day on his way to Wyoming, where he was going to be a cowboy. Then he caught sight of Ada June sitting on her folks' veranda and stopped to pass the time of day. He stayed for supper and ate a dish of Ada June's bread pudding, then a second helping, and asked if anybody in Harveyville was looking for a hired hand. "Wait till you taste Ada June's bread pudding. She's famous for it," I said. When I saw Ada June blush, I knew she had made it in honor of Rita, so I laid it on as thick as cream. Bread pudding's like quilting. Ada June and I can take the same pattern and the same material, but our quilts are as different as the sun and moon. I use stale bread and milk and eggs, but my bread pudding's as dull as jello, while Ada June's is fine enough to take first prize at the state fair. It would if the fair had a category for bread pudding, that is, you know what I mean. "Oh, I've never made bread pudding. I don't like it much," Rita said. Of course, Rita couldn't know that she had hurt Ada June's feelings, because she didn't know how special that bread pudding was. I patted Ada June's arm and called into the other room, "Guess what we've got for refreshments?" Everybody else carried on over Ada June's dessert just as I had. Ella clasped her hands and said, "My favorite." The others put aside their sewing so they'd have room in their laps for refreshments. Ada June, Rita, and I carried the dishes into the room, and nobody said another word except for compliments until the pudding was gone and Ada June began clearing the bowls. Sarah's Root, who is the only living founding member of the Persian Pickle Club, picked up the last raisin out of her dish with her fingers and asked Rita if she'd met Tom in college. Rita glanced at Agnes T. Ritter, then said, "He was a customer at the Coffee Cup Cafe where I was a waitress. Tom came in for coffee and left me a 25-cent tip. He did that every day for a week. Then he invited me to the picture show. It was Son of Kong." "How romantic," Ella Crook whispered. She was small and wispy and blushed when she talked, as if she ought not to have spoken. We had to listen hard to understand her, but we always strained our ears because she didn't speak up often. Besides, we loved her so. "There wasn't anything romantic about Son of Kong. Don't you remember we went over to Topeka, Mrs. Judd said. She was the blusteriest member of the club and the hardest to please, but in all the years I'd known her, I'd never known Mrs. Judd to say a cross word to Ella." I like that monkey, Ella said, then blushed and picked up her sewing. Rita's Cafe was one of those places that never heard of nutrition and spells coffee cup cafe with K's, Agnes T. Ritter said. She meant for us to frown, but I thought using K instead of C was classy. Make that Klassy. I thought Rita would appreciate the little joke, and I hoped I'd remember to tell it to her. I also decided that as soon as I finished the double wedding ring quilt I was piecing, I would make a coffee cup quilt. Just you wait, Agnes T. Ritter. The coffee cup quilts with a KKK. I thought you went to the university, Forrest Ann Finding said. Forrest Ann was a widow lady and Nettie's sister-in-law because Nettie was married to Forrest Ann's brother, Tyrone. Forrest Ann was still pretty and slender, with hair the rusty color of ripe maize and freckles like a sprinkling of cinnamon across her nose, while Nettie, even though she was younger, had gray hair and skin. Being Tyrone Burgett's wife was harder than being his sister. Oh, I did, but I worked too. After Tom and I got married, I worked full time since there wasn't enough money for both of us to go to school. I want to get a degree too, like Agnes, only in English. Agnes has a degree in home economics. They know that, Agnes T. Ritter said. She'd always thought she was better than the rest of us, even though home economics wasn't something important like teaching. I thought it was stupid to spend all that money going to college to learn the very thing you learned growing up on a farm. Tom and I had a small wedding, just the two of us. We were married by the judge, but I had a new pink dress. Married in pink? Your fortune will sink, Forrest Ann said. No such thing, Nettie told her. It's your husband will stink. Rita didn't pay any attention to them. Then I lost my job, she said, and she didn't have to finish. We understood. She wasn't the only one going through hard times. We needed Tom on the farm, Mrs. Ritter added quickly. We'd been trying to talk him into coming home. Well, I for one am glad Tom went to farming, I said. We all are, Nettie added, but we all weren't. We were glad Tom had come back to Harveyville and brought Rita, but going to farming that summer meant you had reached the end of your road. With the crops burning up and the dust blowing in, farming was the last thing anybody wanted to do. I looked out the window, the way we all did from time to time, hoping I could be the one to say, "Why, look at there, it's raining off to the west." It wasn't raining, however. It never was. The air was hot and dry and dusty. I picked up my needle and felt the grit on it. The quilt piece I worked on was smudged from the dust, and so were my hands, which were as wet as Opalina's. "You're a city girl, aren't you?" Mrs. Judd asked. Rita nodded. Tom wasn't sure I'd like it here. Once he wrote me a letter asking if I thought I'd like this part of Kansas, or whether I thought it would be too much like heaven for me. Rita blushed and ducked her head. Ella sucked in her breath. And I thought I'd never read anything that pretty in all of the 101 poems in Ada June's book. No wonder Rita fell in love with Tom. Well, it is, Ella asked, and we all laughed, even Mrs. Judd. Ella looked confused. We returned to our sewing and were quiet for a time. Then Mrs. Judd cleared her throat, and I wondered what we were in for. The Reverend Foster Olive called me, she said, and I let out a little groan. I wasn't alone. Reverend Olive was the pastor of the Harveyville Community Church, which even the Catholics attended because it was the only house of worship in town. Grover said he'd rather listen to a dog bark than Reverend Olive preach, but that wasn't the only reason I didn't care for him. He was always asking the Persian Pickle Club to make a quilt so he could raffle it off to our husbands to buy hymnals or a fancy new altar to replace the one Grover's grandfather had carved. He's like a hard woman. He always comes back, muttered Forrest Ann. What is it this time? Mrs. Ritter asked. I wouldn't mind it so much if we were helping less fortunates, but Foster wants money to buy things the church doesn't need. You think he'd ask our opinion about what to spend the money on, since we're the ones who've got to raise it. Reverend Olive doesn't ask our husbands to plant corn for the Lord. What makes him think we want to be quilters for Jesus? Nettie, Nettie asked, looking at Forrest Ann. Sometimes Nettie blasphemed just to make Forrest Ann blush. The two of them always tried to get the better of each other, although I knew they were close, closer than either one of them was to Tyrone, in fact. But that figured. Who'd want to be close to Tyrone Burgett? Forrest Ann pretended she hadn't heard, and Nettie added, "That man's like a sore thumb, always on hand." Mrs. Judd stuck out her chin with its little collection of warts that looked like the tips of screws and said, "He wants a steeple like the one they got for the Methodist church over to Auburn." "Oh, it's ugly. It looks just like it came from the ugly steeple factory," I said, which made Rita laugh out loud. Everyone turned to stare at her because it wasn't a joke. "How are we going to tell him?" Mrs. Judd asked. Why, it looks like Foster has to put the fear of God into use, Septima." Mrs. Ritter joshed. "Why, it looks like Foster has to put the fear of God into use, Septima," Mrs. Ritter joshed. I looked over at Ada Jane, who put her hand in front of her mouth to hide her smile. There weren't many people Mrs. Judd wouldn't stand up to, so you almost had to admire Reverend Olive for that. I was disappointed, however, because if Mrs. Judd didn't have the nerve to tell him we weren't going to make him a quilt, who would? "I say we tell him we're busy with our own charity," Nettie said. "What charity's that?" Mrs. Judd snorted. We all thought it was over for a minute, then I piped up. "There's a home in Kansas City where girls who aren't married but are in the family way can go and live until their babies are born. We can make a quilt to raise money for them." Nettie and Forrest Ann looked at each other and frowned, but they didn't object until they heard what Mrs. Judd had to say. Mrs. Judd took off her glasses and pinched the bridge of her nose while she thought it over. I held my breath until the end. "That's an awful good idea, Queenie. I guess I'd rather help girls like that than buy a steeple." Nettie and Forrest Ann stopped frowning and nodded. "We can make a rocky road to Kansas," Opalina suggested. "Not if I have anything to say about it," Mrs. Judd told her. "I've seen too many of those Kansas rocky roads to put them in a quilt, especially one that goes to help a less fortunate." Before anyone else could suggest a pattern, I spoke up. "Let's make it a celebrity quilt. You send a square of fabric to famous people and ask them to sign their names to it. I'd read about celebrity quilts in the Kansas City Star and had wanted to make one ever since. But who'd autographed a quilt square for me?" Now that the quilt was for a good cause, famous people all over the country would want to send in their names. I said we should each make a list of the people we admired and bring it to the next meeting. Then we'd write letters to the celebrities explaining what the quilt was for. The rest of the club agreed that was a fine idea. "Here's something else. Famous people are pretty busy and they won't answer by return mail, so it's going to take a long time to get that quilt put together, and by then Reverend Olive will have given up on the steeple or found some other way to buy it," I said. "Besides," Ada Jane added shyly, "us raising money for unmarried mothers will surely get under Reverend Olive's skin, Lizzie's too." That tickled us all. "What do we do if Foster sends Lizzie over to help us?" Opalina asked. "Do we have to let her sew?" "In a pig's eye, you leave Lizzie to me," Mrs. Judd said, being her tough old self again. She glanced at Ella, who never was nasty to anyone, and once or twice said it would be a kindness to invite Lizzie to join the Persian Pickle. "Now, don't you say anything about it," Mrs. Judd told Ella. "You've got the problem of thinking people are nicer than they are. Pickle just wouldn't be the same if Lizzie was to join." We all nodded. Lizzie Olive was thin as whey and just as tasteless. She wanted to be in the Persian Pickle more than anything. It was odd the way women were about our club. There was some like Lizzie who would have given 6 months reign to belong, but we didn't invite them. Others, like Nettie's girl Velma, who was automatically part of the club because her mother was a member, never came. Velma Burgett worked at the Hollywood Cafe in Harveyville until Tyrone heard about how the men acted around her. He slapped her face, dragged her home, and said he'd take a strap to her if he ever heard of her going in there again. I guess he was afraid she'd turn out to be a drunk like him. Forrest Ann told me that Velma sneaked out nights. She was as wild as hemp, which worried Nettie and Forrest Ann, but I knew sooner or later she'd settle down. She'd start coming to club after she found a husband. It was marrying that made women appreciate other women. We had our differences in Persian Pickle. My stars, we'd be as dull as checkers if we didn't, Mrs. Ritter told me once, but when any one of us was in need, she got the support and understanding that a man never provided. There wasn't anything we couldn't share or a secret we wouldn't keep. Forrest Ann must have been thinking the same thing, and she spoke up. Lizzie's such a gossip. Why, if she had the least idea— Be still, Nettie interrupted her, glancing at Rita. Ada June changed the subject. I have just the thing for you, Rita, she said, standing up and going to the sideboard. She took an envelope out of the drawer and handed it to her. Here's my templates for a 9-patch. It's a good quilt pattern for you to start on. I wish I'd thought of that. 9 patches is easy as pie, and it goes fast, I told Rita. It's made up of 9 patches, 3 to a row, 3 up, and 3 across. That's why it's called a 9-patch. You make a big patch out of the little 9 patches, then you put it to the next square of fabric. That's the same size as your 9-patch. It's like geometry, Rita said. It pleased us all that she'd gotten the hang of it right away. I like to think of it like cornfields next to wheat fields, Sarah said, rubbing her hands. They were crippled with arthritis, and Sarah's couldn't quilt the way she used to, but she came to the Persian Pickle Club anyway. She said she'd die if she gave up quilting. When there wasn't a drought, and you can tell the difference between wheat and corn, Mrs. Judd threw in, and we all sighed. That's the truth, said Mrs. Ritter. Maybe that 9-patch ought to be all black and brown. I could make it in yellow and white, Rita said, after she studied the scraps. I'll buy the material next time Tom takes me to town. None of us said anything for a minute. Rita had plenty to learn about quilting. You didn't just go out and buy all the fabrics, even if you had the money, which most of the members did not. You made quilts out of what was on hand, like flowered feed sacks or pieces remaining when you cut out a blouse, or from trading scraps with one another. You got pleasure knowing this piece was left over from your high school graduation dress, or that one was passed down from your grandmother. Forrest Ann said quilt scraps were just like found money. Of course, sometimes you went out and spent a nickel at the Flint Hills Home and Feed for 1/8 of a yard of material you just had to have, but you didn't buy yards and yards to make a quilt top. We couldn't explain that to Rita when it was something you didn't say. You just knew. Who would be that rude? Agnes T. Ritter would, that's who. I guess Tom has a pot of money buried someplace, was the way she put it. Agnes T. Ritter was the only one of us who was mean-spirited. Rita didn't get it. She looked at me the way you look at somebody who is your friend when you need help. That pleased me. We're used to making do, I explained, looking around the table. Rita's too polite to ask us for scraps, but I expect we have enough to get her started. Since I don't always say things right, I was pleased with the way that came out. Ella was right behind me while I was speaking. She took out her scissors and snipped a little piece of yellow flowered goods with green dots in it. The cut piece was exactly the size of Ada June's small template, even though Ella hadn't measured. Without a word, she pushed the patch across the table to Rita with her needle. Before you knew it, we'd all reached into our work baskets for our best material. Everybody but Agnes T. Ritter, that is. She didn't have any scraps. Anyway, Sarah gave Rita a piece with cherries printed on it, saying it came from the Marshall Field store in Chicago. She wasn't bragging, she just wanted Rita to know it was special. Forrest Ann handed her a sliver printed with windmills in what we called that green. It was the color of the enamel trim on my stove and Mrs. Judd's double boiler, and it was in all the new materials nowadays. Then Opalina handed Rita a small piece of gold velvet with a pansy that she'd embroidered that very afternoon for her crazy quilt. You cut that into a little square and let it peek out of your nine patch, she said. Of course, velvet didn't have any place in a plain old nine patch made of wash goods, but it was the thought that mattered. And later, long after Rita was gone and Mrs. Ritter had brought out the top for us to quilt, I got to make the stitches around the pansy. After we quilted it, Mrs. Ritter kept the nine patch in the kitchen over the rocker, and whenever I looked at it, I searched for the yellow zigzags I gave Rita that day, then for the pansy. Time always went fast at the Persian Pickle Club, but that day it just flew. Even Mrs. Judd, who usually gave the high sign when it was time to go home, forgot to keep track of the hour. Not until we heard the parlor clock chime did we realize we'd gone an hour past our time. "Oh dear, it's 5," Forrest Ann said, as upset as if she had looked out and seen a dust storm boiling up over the house. Ada June and I exchanged glances, and Nettie shot out an angry look. But whether it was to show her disapproval to Forrest Ann or to warn the rest of us to keep our mouths shut, I couldn't tell. None of us would have breathed a word of criticism anyway. If Forrest Ann let that man stop by her house every night at 5 o'clock, it was her business, not ours, even if he was married. Sometimes I wish I didn't have a man to feed each and every evening. It'd be nice to go home to the radio and my sewing, Opalina said. She wanted to let Forrest Ann know she thought being a widow wasn't always such a bad thing. I didn't look at Forrest Ann, however. I looked at Ella, who didn't have a husband either. She didn't have even a radio to keep her company. In fact, the old Crook place had no electricity, but Ella didn't mind. She sewed in the evenings by kerosene lamp, or even candlelight sometimes, because it was like having stars inside her house, she said. Mrs. Judd looked at Ella too. "Come along, sweetheart. You can stay to supper with me. You're better company than Prosper. He can't talk about anything but the crops drying up." The rest of us sighed, because that's all any of our husbands talked about. Mrs. Judd tucked the sugar sack square of cloth with the butterfly she'd been embroidering on it into her sewing basket and stood up. "What do you say we make us a big dish of popcorn for dessert, Ella, even if it's the middle of summer? I haven't had popcorn for the longest time." "Oh, my favorite," Ella said. Outside, Rita passed her hand around again for us to shake, and Ella couldn't resist touching the hem of Rita's pretty dress. "It's just like milkweed silk," she murmured. Mrs. Judd told Rita, "You have any sewing you want done, you come see Ella here. She sews better than anybody in 100 miles. Then she added, "She's a worker." We all nodded, because that was the biggest compliment you could give a Kansas woman. You didn't say she was smart or pretty. You said she was a worker, and Ella was a worker. In her embroidered white dress with a wisp of hair curling around her thin face, Ella resembled the girl on the Whitman candy box. But she was a regular farm wife who chopped wood and slaughtered pigs. She was stronger than she looked, and older. She was as old as Mrs. Judd, which was more than 60. "Oh, I would, but I'm going to learn to sew myself," Rita said, and blushed. What she meant was that she was broke like the rest of Kansas. You do that. Mrs. Judd opened the driver's door of the yellow Packard, and Ella scooted in across the leather seat. The old touring car sagged, and Mrs. Judd stepped on the running board. I noticed she'd rolled her stockings down around her ankles when it got hot during quilting, and had forgotten to roll them back up. Her legs above the rolls were angled from rickets, and as white as birch sticks. Mrs. Judd sank into the seat beside Ella and started the motor, and we watched as the Packard lumbered out onto the road. Sometimes it didn't make it, and then Mrs. Judd had to tinker with the motor. I always think of Mutt and Jeff when I see Ella and Mrs. Judd together, Ada Jane whispered. Oh, or Laurel and Hardy, I said. Or Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, Rita chimed in. The three of us laughed about that all the way over to my car. I drove a Studebaker Commander that Grover's father had bought back when farming paid enough to live on. As I opened the door, I knew Rita was going to be more fun than a shoebox of kittens, and I turned around and hugged her, saying how glad I was she had moved to Harveyville. That's what this story is about. Rita coming to Harveyville and joining the Persian Pickle Club and learning the meaning of friendship. It's about me too, of course, and about how I never can keep my mouth shut. That's the end of chapter 1. All right, we'll read another chapter another time. It's going to be a good story. Bye, y'all.